In a war-torn European village, the air was thick with the stench of decay, a heavy pall cast over every house, every street, every face. The once vibrant landscape, full of life and activity, had been reduced to rubble. The sound of birds had long since been replaced by the distant rumble of military trucks, the ominous clank of tanks, and the desperate murmur of civilians living in the constant shadow of occupation. The winter chill, which cut through the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be out in the open, was a constant reminder of their situation. There was no warmth to be found, not in the homes, now stripped of their comforts, nor in the hearts of those who had borne witness to atrocities so frequent that they no longer even shocked the soul. It had been months, perhaps longer, since the invaders had first arrived. The village, nestled deep within the heart of a once peaceful region, had become a microcosm of the devastation that rippled across Europe. The occupying forces were relentless, their commands sharp and unforgiving, delivered with the cold efficiency of an army that saw the people they governed as little more than pawns on a map. Every day brought fresh uncertainty, new rationing orders, new curfews, new demands to surrender, to comply, to go along with whatever the military leadership had decided. Fear had become the currency of the day, and survival, a matter of careful negotiation. But it wasn't just the occupiers that weighed heavy on the villagers' minds. It was the unspoken, looming threat that something worse was always on the horizon. While the soldiers' presence was like a dark cloud overhead, it was the anticipation of harsher times that gnawed at the people's bones. The worst rumors had taken root, word of raids, of people being dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, of towns being wiped off the map. The constant hum of military activity in the area seemed to amplify the villagers' sense of helplessness. They lived in an unceasing state of alert, eyes darting toward every passing soldier, every distant vehicle, every shadow that moved. The possibility of violence was ever present. At any moment, the peace they had so desperately clung to could be shattered by the cold efficiency of war. The streets, which had once been filled with the sound of children playing and families going about their daily lives, were now hauntingly quiet. The few souls brave enough to leave their homes moved swiftly, with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with the soldiers. The laughter of children, once so common, had all but disappeared, replaced by the sorrowful whispers of adults. If anyone still dared to dream, it was in fleeting moments, when their minds would wander back to a time when things were normal, before the occupation, before the war, before everything had changed. But those moments were rare, and they never lasted long. It was as if the people had learned to suppress their very hope, fearing that any spark of optimism would be snuffed out by the harsh realities of their existence. The stores, too, had been emptied, either looted or locked away by their owners who had long since abandoned any thought of profit or preservation. What little food remained was carefully hoarded, rationed out in a slow, methodical process. There were no longer any celebrations, no more communal meals or gatherings. The simplest of pleasures, like the taste of fresh bread or the joy of a warm meal shared with loved ones, had become distant memories, relics of a time before the harshness of occupation took root. The few remaining supplies, scarce as they were traded in furtive exchanges, as people learned to barter for what they needed, exchanging precious items like clothes, tools, and even family heirlooms for food. But even that felt like a hollow transaction. There was nothing left that held meaning beyond survival. And then there was the hunger. It was more than just a physical ache. It had become a pervasive, gnawing presence, a reminder that every day could be the day the last morsel of food would be consumed. The village had once known abundance, a steady supply of crops, livestock, and stores, but now there was only the growing desperation. People scavenged for scraps, and the younger ones, those too young to fully understand the depths of the crisis, grew thinner with each passing day. The sight of a child's hollow cheeks and listless eyes was one that no parent should ever have to witness, but it had become an unfortunate reality for many. For the elderly, for the sick, the hunger was not just a discomfort, it was the slow erosion of everything they had once known. It was a death sentence in slow motion, as bodies that had survived for years now began to wither from the inside out. The soldiers, for their part, were not without their own burdens. The occupation had not been without cost for them either. Their uniforms, once pristine, were now worn and stained, their faces marked with exhaustion. They too had witnessed horrors, things that the civilians could only guess at, things that had hardened their hearts. They moved through the village like shadows, their presence heavy and oppressive, a constant reminder of the power they held. Yet, even among the soldiers, there was a palpable weariness. They too were human. They too had families back home, distant and out of reach. Some had been conscripted, sent to fight a war that they did not fully understand, their lives altered forever by the whims of far-off leaders. And though they carried the weight of their orders with unwavering discipline, there were moments when the hollowness in their eyes betrayed the toll that war had taken on them. It was in this environment, this frayed and fragile existence, that the villagers waited, always on edge, never knowing when the next order would come, when the next raid would happen, or when their lives would be upended again. They waited for the harsh commands, for the next chapter of suffering that seemed inevitable. And yet, despite everything, despite the hunger, the fear, the uncertainty, there was a quiet resilience that remained within them. They were survivors in every sense of the word. They had lost so much, but they had not lost everything. Even in the face of all this brutality, they carried within them a sliver of hope, one that, though it seemed to diminish with every passing day, could never quite be extinguished. But as the days dragged on, the villagers found themselves wondering if even that last ember of hope would soon be smothered. Would the soldiers break them? Would the hunger finally claim them? Would they ever again know a day without fear, without suffering? The answer, they feared, would not come from within the village, nor from their own willpower, it would come from the outside. It would come from forces far greater than themselves, forces that they had no power to influence or escape. And so, the waiting continued, punctuated by the dull ache of hunger, the constant sound of military boots marching through the streets, and the creeping sensation that their lives had become nothing more than a series of harsh orders, one after another. Yet, within this bleak existence, there was one thing the villagers knew for certain: they could endure. They had survived so far, and though the future remained uncertain, it was a certainty they clung to. They were human after all. And even in the face of such overwhelming adversity, humanity had a way of persisting, of finding cracks in the walls of despair through which light could filter. But whether that light would come from within or from a source far more unexpected, no one could say. The arrival of the convoy was not marked by any fanfare or hope. It came as quietly as a storm cloud rolling in from the horizon, dark, threatening, and inevitable. For days, the villagers had been on edge, ever aware of the tension that seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken curse. The daily rhythm of survival was now dictated by a constant undercurrent of fear. The military trucks that occasionally rumbled through the village had become familiar, though no less unsettling. Their presence, once a rarity, had now become a constant reminder of the foreign occupation that had taken root in their lives, a reminder that the war was not something distant or abstract but an immediate and visceral part of their reality. On the morning the convoy arrived, there was an unsettling stillness in the air, as though the village itself held its breath, bracing for what was to come. The soldiers, who had grown accustomed to the quiet submission of the villagers, seemed as tense as the civilians themselves. It wasn't just the arrival of the convoy that stirred the unease, it was what the convoy represented. In the past, such arrivals had meant new orders, new regulations, and often new forms of punishment. The people had long since learned to fear the arrival of the trucks, associating them with fresh hardships, more scarcity, and the reminder that they were nothing more than subjects under the rule of a foreign power. But this time, something was different. There were no loud commands shouted by the soldiers. No sudden demands. The convoy arrived with a strange, almost eerie, silence that added to the tension. There was a stark contrast between the usual military precision and this more subdued presence. The trucks, worn from travel, slowly came to a halt in the village square. The noise of their engines faded, leaving behind an odd quietness that felt too heavy. The villagers, who had been hiding in their homes, peered cautiously from their windows, uncertain whether to trust what their eyes were telling them. The soldiers disembarked, their boots thudding softly on the dirt as they stepped onto the ground, their movements slower than usual, as if they were not marching with the usual urgency of an occupying force but instead moving with a weariness that reflected something else, a shared burden, perhaps, one that could not be seen, but was undeniably present. The villagers could hardly believe what they were seeing. These soldiers, who had become their symbol of oppression, were now standing in front of them without weapons raised, without orders barked. They looked like they had seen too much, perhaps been through too much. Their faces, once stern and implacable, now held an expression that suggested they were not entirely immune to the hardship around them. It was a look that spoke of exhaustion, of men who had lived through their own traumas and were, in this moment, more human than they had ever seemed before. The civilians, eyes wide with suspicion, exchanged glances. What were the soldiers doing here? Why had they come? Had they come to offer new orders? More punishment? Or had something else driven them to this village? As the soldiers began to unload from the trucks, it was not new military equipment or supplies that they brought with them. Instead, they began to unload large, canvas sacks. The bags were filled with something that, at first, the villagers couldn't quite make sense of. It wasn't until the sacks were opened and the contents revealed that the villagers' confusion turned to disbelief. Apples. Bright, shiny apples. Fruit that, in the context of their current reality, was almost unimaginable. Fresh, ripe, and untouched. For so long, the people of the village had gone without any kind of fresh food. The very notion of such a gift was as alien to them as the soldiers themselves. The soldiers began to distribute the apples, handing them out with care, almost as though they were aware of the enormity of their gesture. There was no fanfare, no speeches, no grand declarations. The apples were simply offered, passed from hand to hand, person to person, without ceremony. At first, the villagers hesitated. They looked at the soldiers with suspicion, unsure whether to accept such an offering. Could this be real? Could these men, who had invaded their homes and their lives, now be offering something so simple, so pure? The hunger that gnawed at their bellies was immense, but even greater was the wariness in their hearts. They had long since learned to distrust those who held power over them, and they had every reason to believe that this act of kindness could be another form of manipulation, another way to assert control. No one could understand the motivations of the enemy, nor could they understand how something so innocent could come from men who had caused so much pain. Yet, there was something in the air, something that made it hard to ignore the sincerity of the gesture. The soldiers weren't forcing the apples upon anyone. There was no demand for compliance or loyalty in return. The apples were simply there, and it was up to the villagers whether to take them or not. The villagers, many of whom had not tasted fresh fruit in months, stood frozen for a moment, as if afraid that if they moved too quickly, the whole thing would dissolve like a dream. But then, slowly, the first hesitant hands reached out to accept the apples. They were small, and there weren't enough for everyone, but it didn't matter. The simple act of receiving felt like an incredible privilege, one that carried the weight of an unspoken promise, of survival, of life, in a world that had long since forgotten such gifts. The air around them began to shift. The silence that had fallen over the village at the arrival of the convoy started to break, replaced by an awkward tension. The villagers were still unsure, still afraid that any moment could be a trap, a sudden reversal that would leave them feeling foolish for trusting these strangers. But the soldiers, too, were moving in a way that felt unfamiliar. They weren't behaving like conquerors or taskmasters. They were tired men, handing out fruit with a strange kind of humility, their gestures soft and careful, almost reverential. As the apples passed from soldier to civilian, the divide between them began to narrow, just a little. Some of the villagers, still hesitant, held back, but more took the fruit, taking small bites as though savoring a piece of forbidden fruit. The taste, though simple, was like a memory of a life that had once been, a reminder of the world before war, before scarcity, before fear had shaped every action. The children, some of whom had never tasted an apple before, stood at the back of the crowd, eyes wide with curiosity, unsure whether they could even trust such a moment. But even they, eventually, found their hands reaching out for the fruit. There was something profoundly human about it, a moment of shared vulnerability that transcended nationality, rank, and history. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the villagers allowed themselves a moment of something close to joy. The apples, in all their simplicity, represented something that went beyond the material. They were a symbol of humanity, a reminder that in even the darkest of times, there could be moments of kindness. It wasn't enough to undo the suffering they had endured, and it wasn't enough to change the course of the war, but it was enough to stir something deep within them, a flicker of hope, however brief, however fragile. As the last apples were distributed and the soldiers began to pack up, preparing to leave the village, the tension that had filled the air began to shift. The villagers didn't know what to think. They didn't know if this was a trick, a momentary reprieve before something worse came. But for now, they couldn't help but feel something that had long been absent, a glimmer of humanity. For the soldiers, too, the gesture had been something of an unspoken bond, one that couldn't be broken by the harshness of war. In that fleeting moment, the lines between enemy and ally blurred. It was a fleeting connection, but a connection nonetheless, one that would not soon be forgotten. The apples had been passed out, and the villagers, still uncertain, found themselves standing together in a silence that felt both heavy and oddly liberating. It was as if the very act of receiving something as simple and pure as food had altered the air around them. For a moment, they were no longer just the oppressed, living under the constant threat of punishment and hunger. They were just people, standing in a shared moment of humanity, bound not by the weight of occupation, but by something more intangible, a fleeting sense of connection. The apples, small as they were, became the center of their attention, their significance growing beyond the physicality of fruit. In the midst of a landscape that had been stripped of every comfort, every certainty, they became a rare offering of life. To the villagers, who had lived for so long without the luxury of fresh food, each bite was like a brief moment of respite from the unrelenting march of hardship. The crispness of the apples contrasted sharply with the usual diet of bland, stale bread and thin, watery soups, meals that barely satisfied hunger, much less nourished the body. And yet, there was something even more profound in the act of simply eating, of consuming something given with no strings attached, something that wasn't tainted by the cruelty of war. For many of the villagers, particularly the elderly and children, the apples seemed almost surreal. They had forgotten the taste of sweetness, the sensation of fresh fruit on their tongues. The very idea that something as simple as an apple could be so restorative was overwhelming. For the children, it was an unfamiliar experience, one they could barely comprehend. They had grown up in a world where food was scarce, where the promise of something delicious was no more than a distant memory. Their innocence had been stolen by the harshness of their environment, and yet, as they bit into the apples, there was a flicker of something that resembled joy, even if it was fleeting. But the apples were more than just food. They symbolized something deeper, something that cut through the layers of fear, exhaustion, and despair that had suffocated the village for so long. The villagers, who had been reduced to surviving from one day to the next, began to feel something unfamiliar stir within them, a sense of connection, of shared experience, that reached across the divide between them and the soldiers. The war had reduced them to nameless faces, to statistics, to bodies waiting to be consumed by violence. But in that moment, as they took the apples, they were reminded of the part of themselves that was still human. It wasn't that they had forgotten their humanity, it had simply been buried beneath the weight of survival. The soldiers had come not as enemies, but as messengers of an unspoken truth, that, even in the midst of war, there was a capacity for kindness, for generosity, for compassion. The soldiers, too, seemed changed by the exchange. In the days and weeks leading up to this moment, they had seen nothing but death, destruction, and suffering. They had been trained to view the villagers as enemies, as obstacles to be conquered, subjugated, and controlled. Their mission, from the moment they had arrived, had been clear: enforce the will of the occupying forces, uphold the orders handed down from above, and crush any sign of rebellion. But in the quiet moments that had unfolded in the village square, they had experienced something that made them question the simplicity of their orders. These were not faceless, nameless civilians, they were people. People who had been caught in the same storm, people who had lost much, perhaps everything, but who had, against all odds, survived. And in that simple act of offering apples, the soldiers had been reminded of something that war had tried to erase from them: their own humanity. It wasn't that the soldiers suddenly forgot their allegiance or their duty. It wasn't as if the war ceased to exist in that moment. But for the briefest of moments, the line between soldier and civilian blurred. The animosity, the suspicion, the fear that had separated them melted away, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. The villagers didn't trust the soldiers, and the soldiers didn't trust the villagers, but neither could deny the rawness of the moment. The soldiers were not there to dominate, nor were the villagers there to resist. They were simply two groups of people, bound by circumstance, standing in a quiet exchange of kindness. The villagers, who had grown accustomed to seeing the soldiers only through the lens of oppression, were forced to reckon with a new, disorienting reality. The apples had shattered the simplicity of the narrative they had been living in. The soldiers, who had once been the epitome of authority and power, now appeared vulnerable, almost fragile. The lines between us and them began to fade, and in their place, something far more complex emerged. The villagers began to question their assumptions about the soldiers. Could they, too, be suffering? Were they, too, victims of the war, caught in a conflict that had stripped away their choices, their humanity, and their hope? Could the soldiers, who had caused so much pain, also be capable of compassion? The question lingered in the air long after the last apple was passed, and yet there was no easy answer. For the villagers, the soldiers were still the occupying force. They had not suddenly become allies. The war had not ended. The soldiers would leave the village, and the war would continue. But for the first time, the villagers found themselves seeing the soldiers not as the enemy, but as something more complicated: human beings. The simplicity of the apples had exposed the lie that war told, that people were either oppressors or oppressed, that there was no space between the extremes. It was a lie that the war had forced them all to believe, but the apples had momentarily undone it. As the soldiers gathered the last of their equipment and prepared to leave, the villagers lingered in the square, still processing what had just transpired. There was no overt expression of gratitude or emotion. They didn't cheer, they didn't offer thanks. The gesture had been so simple, so unexpected, that it left them speechless. How could they possibly express their feelings? How could they explain the complex web of emotions that had been stirred in them by such a simple act? But even in their silence, there was something profound. The villagers were no longer the passive recipients of the soldiers' cruelty. They were active participants in a shared human moment, a moment that was not defined by war, but by something deeper. For the soldiers, too, the encounter left a mark. They had been trained to see their mission as a simple one: occupy, subdue, control. The villagers were an obstacle to be overcome, not individuals with lives, families, and hopes. But the moment the apples were distributed, the soldiers found themselves faced with the uncomfortable reality that their actions were not as simple as they had once believed. The lines of division, soldiers versus civilians, oppressors versus oppressed, suddenly seemed too rigid, too defined. In the act of giving something so small, so innocuous, the soldiers had unknowingly crossed a boundary. They had offered something that could not be repaid, something that was not part of their mission. They had given a piece of themselves, even if only for a moment. The convoy left as quietly as it had arrived, and the villagers returned to their homes, their lives unchanged in the grand scheme of the war. The hunger would return, the soldiers would return, and the war would continue its unrelenting march. But the apples and the exchange that had accompanied them would remain in the hearts and minds of both the soldiers and the villagers. It was a brief moment, a passing encounter, yet in the vastness of war, it was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of humanity, there was still room for kindness, for generosity, for the simple beauty of sharing something as basic as an apple. As the last of the apples were consumed and the convoy prepared to depart, an unsettling shift took place in the atmosphere, one that would linger in the minds of the villagers long after the soldiers had disappeared from sight. The air, which had once been filled with a constant hum of tension, began to feel strangely lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted, if only momentarily. The villagers, still processing the surreal exchange, began to look at one another with expressions that could not be described by words alone. There was something new in their eyes, something subtle, yet profound. It was as if the simple act of sharing the apples had broken down the walls of suspicion, if only for a fleeting moment, and revealed the raw, vulnerable humanity beneath. The soldiers, too, were transformed by the exchange. Their movements, which had been sharp and calculated as they distributed the apples, now appeared slower, more deliberate. They no longer seemed like the faceless enforcers of an occupying power. Instead, they stood as men, tired and worn, their faces reflecting something deeper than just the stress of war. It was as if the offering of something as simple as fruit had reopened a door to something they had long suppressed, the awareness that they, too, were part of the human condition, caught in a struggle far greater than themselves. For a brief moment, the soldiers had seen the villagers not as an obstacle or an enemy, but as fellow human beings, struggling with the same fears, the same hunger, the same unspoken pain. In the silence that followed, something profound occurred. The divide between the occupiers and the occupied began to blur. For the villagers, the line between enemy and neighbor, between soldier and civilian, had been fractured. They could no longer look at the soldiers with the same eyes. The narrative they had been living, the one in which the soldiers were a monolith of cruelty and oppression, was no longer as simple or as clear-cut as it once had been. The soldiers, too, had shifted in the villagers' minds. They were no longer just the faceless agents of destruction, but men who had shown, however briefly, a side of themselves that was vulnerable, that was capable of something more than cold obedience to orders. The soldiers, for their part, did not speak much to each other as they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. They moved methodically, but there was an unmistakable weariness in their movements, a weariness that had little to do with the fatigue of battle and everything to do with the weight of the moment they had just shared. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that pressed down on them, it was something more internal. They had given something of themselves in that brief encounter, something they hadn't expected to give, and something that could not be easily forgotten. The human connection they had formed, however brief, had left its mark on them. And as the convoy slowly began to pull away, the soldiers couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they returned to the war, to the conflict that had stripped them of their own humanity. The villagers watched in silence as the convoy drove off, the familiar rumble of the trucks gradually fading into the distance. The sense of disbelief that had initially gripped them began to give way to a strange sense of reflection. What had just happened? How had such a simple gesture, an offering of apples, been able to disrupt the carefully constructed narratives they had built around the soldiers and the war? It was as if the fabric of their existence had been momentarily torn, revealing a layer of truth beneath the surface. They had known hunger, they had known fear. They had known what it was like to be oppressed, to be at the mercy of forces they could neither control nor understand. But they had also known resilience, and in that moment of quiet exchange, they had been reminded of a truth that had always remained hidden beneath the surface of their lives, that even in the darkest of times, there was a human thread that connected them all. The village, however, was not without its scars. The hunger would return. The scarcity would persist. The soldiers, though they had offered something precious, were still the enforcers of an occupying force, and their actions, however brief and seemingly kind, had not changed the reality of the villagers' lives. The war was still very much alive, and the soldiers would not remain forever. The villagers would continue to live under the shadow of occupation, haunted by the uncertainty of the future. Yet, as they went about their daily routines, they found themselves looking at each other differently. There was a subtle shift in their interactions, a new understanding that, though unspoken, had begun to take root. They no longer saw each other only as victims, as passive recipients of fate's cruelty. They saw one another as survivors, human beings who had endured the unimaginable and were, despite everything, still standing. For the children, the exchange had been a moment of bewildering joy. To them, the apples had been more than just food, they had been a symbol of something they had never known. A gift, an act of kindness that came from nowhere, offered with no strings attached. The innocence they had lost through the harsh realities of war was momentarily restored. They had been given something that reminded them of a time before the war, before the hunger, before the ever-present fear. It was a moment they would never forget. But even as the taste of the apples lingered on their tongues, they could not ignore the truth that surrounded them. The war was still there. The soldiers would return. The hunger would return. But something had shifted within them. They had experienced a brief reprieve from the cruelty of their circumstances, and it was a reprieve they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The adults, too, were affected in ways they could not easily articulate. They had lived through so much, seen so much. They had learned to survive, to endure, to keep going even when every instinct told them to give up. They had learned to distrust, to hide their emotions, to suppress any thoughts of hope. They had learned that, in a world so broken, kindness was a rare and dangerous thing, something that could be used against them, something that could be manipulated. And yet, in the quiet exchange of apples, they had seen something different. They had seen humanity in its rawest form, unadorned and unmasked. It was a humanity that did not depend on nationality or allegiance, but on something deeper, something innate. The soldiers, in their own way, had reminded them of that. And so, the villagers returned to their homes, their lives, still uncertain, still fraught with danger. The soldiers, too, would return to their duties, to the war, to the violence that had torn the world apart. The apples would eventually be forgotten, replaced by the daily grind of survival, by the constant tension of living under occupation. Yet, for those who had been present in that brief, fragile moment of kindness, there was no going back to the way things had been. The apples, simple as they were, had disrupted the carefully constructed narrative of good and evil, of victim and oppressor. The soldiers were no longer just the enemy. The villagers were no longer just victims. They were human beings, flawed, fragile, and capable of both cruelty and compassion. In the weeks and months that followed, the village remained under occupation, its people continuing their struggle to survive. The war raged on, its violence unchecked. But every now and then, in the quiet moments when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, the villagers would find themselves remembering the apples, the brief exchange, the kindness that had come from unexpected hands. It was a memory that would endure, a small but powerful reminder that, even in the worst of times, even in the depths of war, there could still be moments of grace, moments of humanity, and moments of hope. And in those moments, the villagers found strength. They had endured the worst the world could offer, but they had also experienced the best of what humanity had to give, even if it was just for a moment. And that, they realized, was something worth holding on to. The village returned to its quiet, familiar rhythm after the convoy's departure, but the shift in the collective consciousness of its inhabitants remained palpable. The harsh weight of occupation, the hunger, the cold, and the ever-looming threat of violence had not disappeared, but something had subtly changed in the hearts of the villagers. The air seemed different now. It wasn't lighter, not by any means. The fear, the uncertainty, and the exhaustion still clung to their every action. Yet, there was a strange quietness that had settled over them, one that seemed to press down on the village as if time itself had slowed, drawing the villagers into a space of introspection that was almost impossible to escape. The villagers couldn't help but replay the events of that day, the quiet distribution of apples, the sudden shift in the soldiers' behavior, the way the villagers had hesitated before taking the fruit, as if expecting some terrible consequence. But when they finally bit into the apples, it wasn't the taste of bitterness they expected. It was sweetness, fresh and tart, a reminder of something pure in a world corrupted by war. It had been so simple, so human, and yet it had torn through their perceptions, breaking down the barriers that war had erected between them and their occupiers. Days passed, and life in the village went on as it had before. The soldiers didn't return immediately, but their presence was never far from the minds of the people. They couldn't escape the reality of occupation. The curfews were still enforced, the rationing still held them in a constant grip of hunger. Yet, even amidst the daily grind of survival, there were moments when the villagers found themselves looking at one another differently. There was something in the way they spoke now, something in their eyes, a quiet recognition of shared humanity. The war, for all its cruelty, had opened a crack in their hearts. And that crack, though painful, let in a faint, fragile light. But it wasn't just the villagers who were changed. The soldiers, too, carried the memory of the apples with them, each in their own way. It wasn't as though the war had ceased to exist, or that the occupying force suddenly developed sympathy for the people they were subjugating. The soldiers were still soldiers, and the war raged on. But the brief exchange in the village square had planted a seed in them, one that was more difficult to ignore than the soldiers would have liked to admit. They had been trained to follow orders, to crush resistance, to occupy without questioning the morality of their actions. But in that moment when they had handed out the apples, they had questioned something. They had looked into the eyes of the civilians and seen not just fear, not just hatred, but something else. Something raw and unspoken, something human that they could no longer ignore. As the days turned into weeks, some of the soldiers began to talk amongst themselves, quietly, in hushed tones that were barely audible against the backdrop of the war. They spoke of the villagers, of the moment they had shared, of the look in their eyes when the apples were passed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir something within them. The soldiers had always been taught to see the people they occupied as the other, to dehumanize them to make their actions easier to bear. But those apples had shifted something fundamental. For the first time, they had seen the villagers not as faceless masses, not as mere pawns in a war, but as individuals. As people who had lost their homes, their families, their dignity, and who had somehow, despite everything, managed to endure.